is one of the most widely criticized wars in American history. A war that drafted and sent thousands of young men across the ocean to join a brutal fight in unfamiliar terrain, up against an enemy that seemed to be both everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The Vietnam War seemed to many to be no more than a fool's errand, an unwinnable fight. Sure enough, by the end of the conflict, the mighty US military had been brought to its knees. However, some will argue that the US didn't lose the war per se, but rather got bored and withdrew due to intense public pressure. Well, today we're going to get to the bottom of what happens in one of the Cold War's most infamous conflicts and why the United States ultimately failed in Vietnam. The story of US intervention in Vietnam begins right after the end of World War II and actually starts with the French. Back then, the modern-day countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were all part of a colonial territory known as French Indochina. French Indochina had revolted against colonial rule several times throughout the years, but after the region was liberated from Japan following the Pacific War, the people had had enough of foreign powers controlling their lands. The First Indochina War began in 1946 as groups of rebels began fighting to end French rule once and for all. Despite the French clearly having the advantage in terms of firepower and technology, they found it hard to deal with the guerrilla-style warfare in the villages and dense jungles. And yes, that's what we call foreshadowing. Are you ready for some high-octane action and epic vehicle battles? Well, I've got something amazing to share with you today. Today's sponsor, Crossout. Crossout is not your ordinary vehicle shooter. It's a game where you can unleash your creativity and build your own unique vehicles from scratch. From the chassis to the weapons, the possibilities are endless. With hundreds of parts, armor plating, and a wide range of weapons, Crossout gives you the freedom to create the ultimate war machine. Whether you're into traditional cannons, or maybe laser guns, or guided rockets, the game has got you covered. And what I love most about Crossout is its advanced damage model. You can strategically shoot off specific parts of your enemy's vehicle, affecting its performance in real time. Take out the wheels, blast off the guns, or maybe just cut them in half, because why not? But wait, there's more. Crossout offers a highly developed PvE experience with complete free roam adventure. Immerse yourself in a Mad Max-style setting where you'll encounter unique characters, engage in thrilling missions, and explore a post-apocalyptic world like never before. What makes Crossout even better is they've got part-based matchmaking, so you'll be pitted against players with similarly powerful vehicles, so you won't immediately get destroyed, which is what would absolutely happen to me. Plus, there's a player-driven economy. You can sell your loot or crafted items on the market and use the profits to get the specific equipment that you want. It's like a virtual marketplace where you're the master of your destiny. So what are you waiting for? Play Crossout now for free on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PS5, or the previous console generation using my link in the description below, or just go to xoplay.link/warographics. By registering through that link, both new and existing users will receive an exclusive bonus pack. You'll get 3 days of premium account access, unique stickers and decorations, and for new players, a special Adventure Seeker vehicle waiting for you in your garage. Thanks to Crossout for sponsoring today's video, and now back to it. After 9 years of fighting, France officially withdrew from the region, and the 1954 Geneva Accords were signed, splitting the region into independent nations, and most crucially, dividing Vietnam into the Communist Allied North and the Western Allied South. Conflict erupted between the North and the South almost immediately. Both halves of Vietnam claimed the entirety of the country, in a situation painfully similar to North and South Korea. And with the Korean War having only recently concluded, both sides of the Cold War were eager to avoid another large-scale conflict. Unfortunately, they were both also eager to avoid losing their grip on some faraway proxy states, and that took clear priority over avoiding war. In the late 1950s, the North began officially organizing an insurgency in the South. What began as isolated rebel groups soon turned into the organized Viet Cong, supplied by a logistical network known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which had been established after North Vietnam invaded Laos. The North Vietnamese Army, or NVA, soon began fighting the South in a conventional war, while the Viet Cong infiltrated southern villages and jungles to set traps and ambushes. Now, at this time in American history, the idea of the communist domino effect was a very influential belief. This was the idea that if one nation fell to communism, the red tide would soon flow into its neighboring countries. In this case, the belief was that if the entirety of Vietnam fell, then communism would spread into Thailand, into India, the Philippines, and so on and so forth. Determined to draw a line in the sand, US President John F. Kennedy began sending military advisors to South Vietnam, but he refrained from getting directly involved. But Kennedy's policies ended with Kennedy's assassination, and President Lyndon B. Johnson had some rather different ideas about Vietnam. In 1964, a US destroyer was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in an event known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. This incident, which today is regarded as highly exaggerated and partially fabricated, was enough to convince Congress to approve a full-scale military presence in Vietnam. By 1965, the United States had sent nearly 200,000 soldiers to not just train their allies, but to directly fight against communism. Remember, at the time, the modern US war machine was largely undefeated. Growing up, all these soldiers had heard of was the glory of US intervention in the First World War, the might of the Allies defeating evil in the Second World War, and the defense of South Korea from communism. As far as anyone could tell, the United States' military was the most powerful in the history of the world, and they were going to make quick work of the disorganized, ragtag communist forces. As the first combat troops landed in Vietnam in March 1965, the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, there was a general sense of optimism that the war would be a short one, and perhaps they'd be home by Christmas. But they could not have been more wrong, and soon enough the United States would find itself stuck in a conflict that they could not win, much like the French before them. Despite a peak presence of more than 500,000 personnel, the US largely failed to achieve any of their objectives and eventually withdrew from the conflict in 1973, having suffered more than 50,000 casualties and an embarrassing defeat. Now, they'd only watch as South Vietnam fell to communism. So, what went wrong? And how did one of history's Goliaths get taken down by a much weaker opponent? Well, let's find out, shall we? The first issue that the US struggled to handle was the enemy that they faced. The stereotype that the Viet Cong and other North Vietnamese forces were disorganized was not entirely true. While it is true that the guerrilla forces were largely decentralized, that does not mean they lacked strategy or tactics. The bulk of US fighting experience up to that point involved conventional wars against conventional opponents. Formations of tanks, fortified bunkers, stuff like that. And in a conventional war, targets are quite simple. When you spot a machine gun nest surrounded by barbed wire, you fire a rocket at it, or when you find the railroad tracks that resupply the enemy, you bomb the hell out of them. But in Vietnam, these targets didn't exist. For example, one of the main objectives early on in US intervention was to destroy North Vietnam supply lines to the Viet Cong. Like we mentioned earlier, this was the Chi Minh Trail, which ran through neighboring Laos and Cambodia and allowed them to effectively move weapons that had been brought in from the USSR and China. Bullets, guns, food, medical supplies, you name it, hundreds of tons of supplies were snuck into South Vietnam to fuel the insurgency day after day. This was obviously a high priority target, and so in 1964, the US Air Force commenced Operation Barrel Roll, followed by Operation Steel Tiger, an immense bombing campaign of the Laotian jungles and highlands. Over the 9 years that this bombing was carried out, a staggering 260 million bombs were dropped on Laos, making it one of the most heavily bombed nations in all of history. And all this despite the fact that Laos was technically neutral in the conflict and that both sides had even agreed to keep it out of the war. Because of this, the unfathomably intense bombing campaigns were largely kept under the table, though they weren't quite as secretive as the CIA-backed paramilitary groups that were formed from local Laotian tribes. These were dispatched to harass the supply lines, and yet, in spite of all of this, the Ho Chi Minh Trail largely ran undisturbed and continued to move several hundred tons of material every day, bringing men and gear into South Vietnam. The bombing of Laos had been a huge strategic failure for the United States, and there's a few reasons why. The first is the terrain. Even if you had a map of your targets, you had little hope of striking them with much precision under the dense jungle foliage. And then the real problem arose. Even if you did manage to hit your target, let's suppose it was some road or trail, the Viet Cong would simply divert their path around it and business would just continue as usual. Because much of the trail involved walking or the use of light trucks, a new path could just easily be cut into the surrounding foliage. The Ho Chi Minh Trail wasn't a single route from North to South Vietnam. It was a complex logistical spiderweb of trails, tunnels, rivers, and roads. You couldn't possibly hope to contain it any more than you'd be able to contain a hurricane. And on top of all of this, it was difficult to even confirm any successful strikes due to a lack of Allied ground troops in the region, meaning that estimates of a bombing run's success were always just estimates. Looking at it from this perspective, Operation Barrel Roll had been a big waste of time and of resources. From the Air Force's perspective, it had done its part in protecting Laos from being completely conquered by the communists during the war, but this had only been achieved at the cost of dropping historic amounts of explosives and turning the country into a giant pile of collateral damage. Similar bombing runs were carried out over North Vietnam as well, under codename Operation Rolling Thunder. But Rolling Thunder ran into many of the same problems that the bombing of Laos had, namely the difficulty of striking targets with precision. Vietnam is mostly mountainous, dense jungle, giving the guerrilla fighters and the NVA the ideal battleground to hide from enemy bombing runs in the hundreds of miles of tunnels that they dug across the countryside. But while the bombing of Laos lasted the entirety of the war, Operation Rolling Thunder was cancelled in 1968 when the North Vietnamese put up an incredibly effective air defense network utilizing Soviet-supplied MiGs and surface-to-air missile systems. And even when enemy fighters weren't a problem, US air power was still not able to be used to its full extent throughout the war. One of the signature tactics of the communist forces was to hug the enemy during battle, staying so close to the American positions that it made it difficult to call in air support or artillery, neutralizing one of the most powerful weapons in the American arsenal. The Vietnamese often refer to this as grab their belts to fight them, a testament to just how close and personal they were willing to get in the brutal jungle combat. Open combat with the Viet Cong was like boxing with one of your arms behind your back, but even when they weren't in open firefights, it was seemingly impossible to even find the enemy. This is because the Viet Cong were experts at both hiding themselves in the environment, quickly relocating out of danger, and blending in with the local population. And this is all in combination with the infamous traps and ambushes that were set for the Americans, including more traditional ones like landmines, but also some more nefarious ones that were sure to make any foreign soldier uneasy the moment they left the safety of the base. Mudball Mines, for example, were a basic trap comprised of a hand grenade encased in sun-dried mud that would explode when the mud was stepped on or otherwise cracked. Bamboo traps, often a hole in the ground with sharpened sticks poking up, could impale you in a second's notice if you weren't paying attention. Even vehicles weren't safe, as several improvised traps were set up in clearings to catch helicopters off guard as they landed. The most heavily booby-trapped places were the Viet Cong's tunnels, which were a complete nightmare for combat engineers to clear out, requiring them to crawl in with not much more than a flashlight and a sidearm. And look, fighting an insurgency is already a Herculean task, but doing so far from home in a thick jungle against an unfamiliar enemy makes it exponentially more difficult. And the only thing that could make it even worse was the next US failure. The failure to win the hearts of the people of Vietnam. Exploring the Vietnam War from the perspective of the locals gives us a wildly different outlook than the typical view of geopolitics in the Cold War. Vietnam has historically been underneath someone's oppressive thumb. First it was China, who battled to take the lands for hundreds of years. Then the French, who colonized it for more than 150 years. Then Japan, and then France again. By the time they'd finally gotten rid of the French, you can imagine just how determined they were to finally have some form of self-governance and finally be more than second-class citizens in their own country. With this in mind, it's quite understandable why communism gained such popularity in the country. The image of the Russian Revolution was powerful. The working class had risen up and taken power, and much of Vietnam was inspired by this tale of taking matters into your own hands. And so, while officially the North was communist and the South was not, there were many people in the South that empathized with the North's ambition. This was especially true in villages, which often harbored Viet Cong soldiers. The problem with this is that it made it almost impossible for Americans to distinguish friend from foe before it was too late, leading to many tragic incidents in which civilians were either caught in the crossfire or intentionally targeted. Part of the problem was that certain areas had been designated free-fire zones, places where the civilians had supposedly been evacuated and only enemy forces remained, but of course, that wasn't always accurate. The other part of the problem was a lack of effective counterinsurgency training and a chain of command that wasn't opposed to turning a blind eye. In the Lai Massacre, for example, As many as 500 innocent Vietnamese were killed by US servicemen, including women and children, simply because the soldiers were expecting Viet Cong resistance in the area and operated on a shoot first, ask questions later type of mentality. And aside from intentional killings, millions of Vietnamese were affected by the bombing operations. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed as a direct result of the bombings, and millions more were injured, displaced, and traumatized. Faced with such indiscriminate attacks and a clear lack of interest in keeping the locals safe, it's really no wonder that many, even in the South, began to view the presence of the United States as doing more harm than good. All it takes is one look at the infamous photo of the napalm girl, who was only 9 years old when she was severely burned on her back from napalm dropped on her village in 1972. It gets even worse when you factor in other tactics employed by American forces. Agent Orange, for example, was an incredibly powerful herbicide dropped over large swaths of Vietnam to clear out thick vegetation and eliminate cover for communist forces. However, it had horrifying effects on anyone exposed to it, including difficulty speaking, muscular stiffness, every cancer you can think of, and countless birth defects. All of this contributed to the distrust of the American forces stationed in Vietnam, and in return, the increase of support to the North. In turn, the South, which was already politically unstable and had already seen its fair share of coups d'etats, began to falter. As the Viet Cong grew in size and influence, America had lost the war in Vietnam's hearts and minds before they'd ever lost on the battlefield. But the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese weren't the only place that the war failed to gain support. Back home in the United States, the anti-war movement gained historic traction as news about the conflict spread. This was the first war in history to have its every move widely televised, giving the American public an unprecedented view into the actions of their armed forces overseas. And they did not like what they saw. Not only were reports of atrocities quickly able to reach the public's attention, but so was a perplexing lack of clear objectives. In World War II, the mission was clear: liberate Western Europe and the Pacific from its occupiers. Likewise, in Korea, the mission was clear: defend South Korea from the invading communists. But Vietnam's objectives were anything but clear. They were more like vague goals, such as limit the scope of communism in Southeast Asia and clear the South of insurgents. Something that's really hard to put into numbers, and indeed the US military struggled to come up with ways to show any concrete progress. Success in Vietnam was largely measured in body counts of dead Viet Cong, something that was easily inflated or miscalculated. Officials were quick to report high numbers of killed enemy combatants, but tangible victories were few and far between. The other common missions were search and destroy operations, aimed at knocking out Viet Cong headquarters or supply depots. But again, the way that the VC operated meant they didn't exactly have a headquarters. Everything was mobile. Everything was spread out through their network of tunnels. The American public was understandably unhappy with all of this. What was the point of sending your son, who had just graduated from high school, to go and get shot in a jungle across the world when you weren't even certain what he was fighting for? The pressure on the US government skyrocketed in early 1968 when North Vietnam launched the ambitious Tet Offensive, one of the largest campaigns of the entire war. The Tet Offensive aimed to capture more than 100 South Vietnamese cities in a largely conventional attack. And what's interesting about this offensive is that despite it turning out to be a monumental failure, as North Vietnam lost more than half of the 100,000 men they sent into it, it turned out to be a critical propaganda victory, as the American public's distrust of their own government only deepened. Despite reassurances from Congress and the president that the defeat had crippled North Vietnam, American casualties continued to rise, reaching their peak the following year, giving rise to what was known as the credibility gap between what the government was saying and what was actually going on. Massive protests began rising up across the United States, demanding a withdrawal from the conflict. The largest of these was in 1969, when as many as 500,000 people marched through Washington, D.C. in the largest anti-war demonstration in American history, nicknamed the March Against Death. The response from President Nixon was to announce that anarchy in the streets would not influence his decision, which further enraged the public. And by 1970, two-thirds of Americans disapproved of the war in Vietnam. The U.S. was now fighting two wars, one in Vietnam, the other at home. Conscripted soldiers often lacked the motivation to fight. They deserted in high numbers and disobeyed orders. Draft dodging became a widespread problem, as it was seen as better to live life under the radar or be thrown in jail than to get sent to Vietnam. Fleeing the draft, many young men even crossed the border into Canada. and soldiers returning from Vietnam were commonly spit on and insulted, far from the hero's welcome that they expected. By the 1970s, the pressure was too much to bear, and the US government began stepping down its involvement in Vietnam through a series of withdrawals. On March 29, 1973, the last American combat troops left Vietnam, marking the end of an era that would define a generation. With the United States no longer in the way, the North soon began large-scale operations into the South and captured the South capital in 1975, marking the end of the Vietnam War. All the time, money and lives poured into the conflict had done little to prevent this outcome. Laos and Cambodia also soon fell to their communist uprisings, but, well, they were the only ones. The domino effect that had been so feared had less power than everyone had believed. There are many things that the United States could have done differently in Vietnam. Perhaps things would have gone differently if they'd answered the French's call for help in the First Indochina War and prevented the partition of Vietnam in the first place. Maybe a large-scale offensive into North Vietnam would have been more effective than a hesitant war against guerrilla fighters in the South. And perhaps things would have gone very differently if the United States had never gotten involved in the first place. In the end, the failure in Vietnam had a lasting impact that still affects American politics to this day: an aversion to foreign intervention, distrust of the government, and a serious hit to American confidence that lasted for years. Well, they can all trace their roots back to the war that, in hindsight, was seen as a largely meaningless conflict that led to the deaths of 58,000 Americans and more than 2 million Vietnamese. Just before you go, a quick reminder that today's video was brought to you by Crossout. If you haven't already, make sure to click the link in the description below or visit exoplay.link/warographics to jump into the action-packed world of Crossout. Remember, using that link, you'll get a special bonus pack. And thank you for watching.